EPA targets Skyland site for cleanup. Location of former CTS plant added to Superfund program. Skyland, North Carolina. The discovery of severe groundwater contamination next to the former CTS of Asheville plant has prompted the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to place the site in its Superfund program for cleanup. This was not exactly the case, seeing as Don Rigger and Fred Stroud had faked an incident on August 21, 1999, ran it through the U.S. Coast Guard National Response Center to generate a new site called Mills Gap Road Groundwater Contamination Site. They dropped it on the Rice property, which violated their 14th Amendment rights that guarantee equal protection under the law and due process. This was done to generate $200,000 to take care of the pre-existing site and the contamination emanating from CTS of Asheville. Continuing with the article, the agency will launch an investigation to determine the source of the problem and if it's serious enough to be ranked on the program's national priority list, said Don Rigger, section chief in EPA's Emergency Response and Removal Branch in Atlanta. The contamination was discovered last month when a resident found a dark, oily substance oozing up into springs just east of the plant property. How could Rigger and Stroud say that an incident occurred on August 21, 1999, when the newspaper is reporting that that had taken place a month earlier? In fact, it was over a month earlier on July 8, 1999. As far as contamination, the levels are very high in the spring, some of the highest I've ever seen. Rigger was saying that 21,000 parts per billion in the Rice's springs that they were drawing their drinking water from was some of the highest he'd ever seen. In 2007, EPA failed to react or respond to levels tested at 293,000 parts per billion of TCE in the same spring. Back to the article. Meanwhile, a well serving a Skyland family near the site has been found to be tainted with high levels of the same chemical detected in the springs, but an EPA emergency response team provided Mac and Becky Robinson with bottled water and is arranging to have them connected to city water. Part of that $200,000 that was generated on August 23, 1999 in creating the fake CERCLA site known as Mills Gap Road Groundwater Contamination Site was used to deliver that very bottled water. I was very hurt, Mac Robinson said, of learning his water supply of more than 20 years had been contaminated. State environmental officials tested 9 wells in the vicinity of Mills Gap and Concord Roads earlier this month, and only the Robinson well was found to be contaminated, said Kay DeCant, acting regional groundwater supervisor with the North Carolina Department of Environment and Natural Resources. Page 2. Skyland groundwater contamination put on Superfund list. That's awkward because the CTS of Asheville Inc. site had already been a part of the Superfund list. In fact, it was in the CERCLA's inventory until Matt Robbins removed it on August 22, 1995. So why didn't EPA unretire the CTS of Asheville Inc. site? Why didn't they just reactivate it? They knew it was connected to the groundwater contamination and the springs and the Robinson well. I would say it's serious, DeCant said. State environmental officials referred to what's now officially known as the Mills Gap Road Groundwater Contamination Site to EPA. Rigger said the idea behind sending in the emergency response team was to eliminate any immediate danger posed to people from the pollution. So why would state officials now call this the Mills Gap Road Groundwater Contamination Site when the CTS of Asheville Inc. site was already in the state's inventory for the Superfund priority list? Why would they go along with that, especially considering how often N.C. Diener, Charlotte Jesnick, Kay DeCant, Chu Chi, Max Hayner had linked in the newspaper, CTS of Asheville to the groundwater contamination. Back to the article. Beside connecting some residents to city water, the team took another initial step Monday by having a contractor dig up and remove some of the chemical-laced soil at the site of the springs, he said. In addition, a small earthen dam was built to catch the oily substance for later removal. And where was that oily substance coming from? Wasn't that the same location as CASDO2, the sample taken in 1990? And wasn't that at the outfall pipe? Wasn't that a drainage pipe draining the CTS of Asheville site into the Rice property without them ever even knowing, or without EPA ever bothering to tell the Rice family? Rigger acknowledged the work was analogous to putting a Band-Aid on a bleeding cut. I'll reread that. Rigger acknowledged the work was analogous to putting a Band-Aid on a bleeding cut. However, a full investigation will be launched to determine the source of chemicals, he said. Earlier testing found trichloroethylene in one spring at a concentration of 21,000 parts per billion, more than 7,000 times the groundwater standard. The samples also contained benzene, xylene, toluene, which are compounds of petroleum products. In determining whether the site should be placed on the Superfund National Priority List, investigators will canvass the area and look for sources like underground tanks and hazardous waste disposal sites. Monitoring wells will probably be installed around the CTS plant property, Rigger said. No timetable has been set for the work, he said. Rigger said that while the contamination is severe, the good news is that it doesn't appear to be widespread, at least not yet. We've had cases where we had to hook up 50 or 60 homes to city water, he said. The CTS plant manufactured industrial switches and resistors for more than 20 years on its 57-acre site before shutting down in 1986. Some of the same pollutants found in the contaminated springs were discovered in soil and stream samples on the plant property during a 1990 inspection by EPA. Now, wasn't it Rigger that had earlier said in this article that they were going to launch an investigation to find the source? And isn't Clark Morrison pointing out to everyone that the same contaminant found in the Rice Springs and the Robinson groundwater well was found in 1990 migrating away from the CTS plant building on its 57-acre site? Clark Morrison should have gone to work for EPA. They should have hired him. He already did the investigation. Back to the article. These toxic substances included cadmium, magnesium, beryllium, nickel, zinc, trichloroethylene, and vinyl chloride. By the way, vinyl chloride is the fourth most dangerous chemical for human exposure, according to the CDC in Atlanta. So those toxic substances included cadmium, magnesium, beryllium, nickel, zinc, trichloroethylene, and vinyl chloride, according to the EPA report from 1990. However, no groundwater testing was done at the time. Not exactly true. They went 4,226 feet away to number 1 Forest Run Drive to take a sample when the Rices were next door, and the Robinson well was 3,000 feet closer. Officials at CTS based in Elkhart, Indiana, have said they don't think the plant is the cause of the problem, but they are willing to work with the state and federal agencies to resolve it. This was written August 25th, 1999. It's 2012, no cleanup. Meanwhile, Robinson said he doesn't think he should have to pay for monthly water bills, and he's hiring an attorney. I had good water, but it's been contaminated by someone else, so someone else is liable, he said. Richard Moss, an environmental sciences instructor at UNCA and water quality expert, said that although the level of contamination at the Robinsons' well is unacceptable and they shouldn't drink the water, chances are good they haven't been harmed. Unfortunately, Ethel Robinson passed away from pancreatic and liver cancer. Shannon Robinson has been given the preliminary diagnosis for thyroid cancer. Shannon's 2 sons, the grandchildren that Becky took care of, have had health problems since they were infants. Dr. Moss closed with, "Nonetheless, it will be important to continue monitoring the surrounding residential wells on a regular basis," Moss said. "The most important thing is for EPA not to stall their investigation on this. They have a reputation for moving unbearably slowly." Well said. The August 26, 1999 editorial from the Citizen Times sums it all up. EPA must make rapid cleanup at former CTS of Asheville site. The handling of toxic substances at the former CTS of Asheville property near the intersection of Mills Gap and Penner's Cove roads raises alarming questions about how state and local government agencies are dealing with contamination sites. The site was investigated by EPA in 1990, 4 years after the company which made industrial switches and resistors on the 57-acre property for 20 years had shut down. It became one of several hundred sites in the state Superfund program after EPA determined it didn't qualify for the National Superfund program. For 10 years, the state has done nothing about the site and would likely have continued to do nothing indefinitely had not a neighbor spotted an oily liquid bubbling up into a spring basin near the CTS site. EPA tests in 1990 showed high levels of toxic substances such as cadmium, magnesium, beryllium, nickel, zinc, trichloroethylene, and vinyl chloride in soil and stream samples, according to an EPA report issued in 1991. The elevated concentrations of inorganic contaminants may be attributed to waste handling practices at the former CTS plant, the report said. But even though the report went on to say that the groundwater pathway is of concern because there are approximately 397 wells within 3 miles of the facility, no groundwater tests were done. Why? We know that EPA went 4,226 feet away to get that one groundwater sample, which turned out to be clean, rather than going 3,000 feet closer to the Robinsons or just next door to the Rices. The report went on to say, The air pathway is of concern because 3,887 people live within 1 mile of the facility, and high concentrations of metals and organic compounds were found in surface and soil samples. Why, then, did the report conclude, based on this evaluation, it is recommended that no further remedial action be planned for CTS of Asheville? With that inexplicable dismissal of concern, EPA handed the site off to the North Carolina Superfund program, where it languished until Bob Taylor discovered an oily mess oozing up from a spring and reported it to the state environmental officials. Charlotte Jesnick, head of the state Inactive Hazardous Sites branch, said the CTS site wasn't addressed by the state Superfund program because she has a staff of just 5 people to deal with about 1,000 sites across North Carolina. It has to wait its turn in priority to be addressed, she said in July. That raises serious questions about what may be found at other sites among those on the state Superfund list. What other sites contained undocumented and unremediated toxic substances that imperil the health of North Carolinians? Water samples taken from the springs in July revealed concentrations of trichloroethylene, a common industrial solvent used at the CTS plant as a degreaser, at 21,000 parts per billion. That's more than 7,000 times the state groundwater standard for the substance. Also found were smaller amounts of benzene, xylene, and toluene, compounds of petroleum products such as gasoline, diesel fuel, and fuel oil. 9 wells have been tested, and 1 has been found to be tainted with high levels of the same chemical detected in the spring. The family that owned the well had been using it for 20 years. 2 families also got their drinking water from one of the contaminated springs. About 40 people had asked to have their wells tested at last report. For their peace of mind, investigators owe it to those who live near the site to test the wells. EPA will now launch an investigation to determine the source of the problem and whether it's serious enough to be ranked on the program's national priority list. One thing is certain: EPA's decision this week to place the former CTS of Asheville plant location in its Superfund program for cleanup comes nearly 10 years late. That puts a heavy burden on the agency to make a speedy determination about the extent of the contamination and to conduct a very rapid cleanup. That was August 26, 1999. The sad thing is that the editorial had connected the source of contamination to the migrating contaminant that was found on the Robinson property and on the Rice property. It was CTS of Asheville Inc. And now EPA begins its unending, perpetual state of investigation, which has led to absolutely minimal cleanup action, has exposed neighbors to unnecessary risk, where we have 50 people that have been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma. We have countless others with brain tumors, pancreatic and liver cancer, and other illnesses. And for what?